I spent 19 days in that hospital bed, and I want you to understand what 19 days actually means before I tell you anything else. It means 456 hours. It means watching the same water stain on the ceiling. Tile change shape depending on the light, until I knew every curve of it the way you know a face. It means a body that's trying to kill itself slowly, one organ at a time, and a family that couldn't find one single hour out of 456 of them to sit in a chair beside me. Not my son, not my husband. Ex-husband, I should say, though some days it still catches in my throat to call him that. Not the daughter I raised from nothing, fed, clothed, drove to dance recitals at 6 in the morning before work. My name is Donna. I'm 54 years old, and this is the story of the month my family showed me exactly where I rank, and the $1 that made them finally feel it. It started on a Sunday, which I remember, because Sunday was the one day a week I let myself sleep past 7, and I never got the chance. I woke up unable to breathe right. This tight, crushing feeling behind my ribs, and by the time the paramedics got me stable enough to talk, I was already being wheeled into a room full of people in scrubs, asking me questions I could barely answer. Acute pancreatitis, complicated by something with my gallbladder that needed surgery before the night was out. The doctor used the words touch and go twice in the same sentence, which is not a phrase you want to hear twice. I called my son from the gurney. My hands were shaking so bad the nurse had to hold the phone up for me. Reed picked up on the fourth ring, television loud behind him, and when I told him I was about to go into surgery, he said, "Oh man, that's rough, Mom. Keep me posted, okay? Keep me posted." Like I was giving him a weather update. I heard him say something to someone else in the room. "Nah, she's fine, just some hospital thing." Before he even hung up properly, I called my ex-husband next, mostly out of habit more than hope. Glenn and I had been divorced 6 years, but we still talked about logistics, about our grown kids, about the house we used to share. He picked up, heard me out, and said, "Geez, well, I hope it goes okay." Then before I could even respond, "Hey, do you still have my pressure washer? I need it back at some point." My pressure washer. I was being wheeled into an operating room and my ex-husband wanted his pressure washer back. My daughter, I didn't even bother calling. Audra and I hadn't spoken in almost a month, not since she'd told me I was too dramatic for bringing up the $1,100 she'd borrowed for her car repair and never once mentioned again. I texted her instead, 4 words. Going into surgery now. She left it on red for 9 hours. The surgery is mostly fog in my memory. Cold lights, masked faces, the particular smell of a hospital operating room that you never forget once you've known it. What I remember with total clarity is waking up afterward. Throat raw from the breathing tube, turning my head toward the door of my room. Expecting, hoping, praying almost, that someone would be sitting there. The chair was empty. It stayed empty for 19 days. I want to be fair, because even when people don't deserve fairness, I think you owe it to yourself to be honest. My son texted twice in 19 days. Once to ask how I was doing, with a thumbs-up emoji attached to my response like that settled it. The second time was to ask if he could borrow my car for a weekend trip since I wasn't using it anyway. My ex-husband sent exactly 1 text the entire time, on day 11, asking again about the pressure washer. My daughter sent nothing, not 1 word, until day 15, when she texted to ask if I still had her curling iron at my place. I lay there and watched the woman in the next bed have visitors every single day. Her husband brought her crossword puzzles. Her sister brought homemade soup in a thermos and sat with her for hours, just talking, just being there. There was a nurse on my floor, a young woman named Priscilla, who started sneaking me extra Jell-O cups because, she said, "Somebody around here should be spoiling you a little." Miss Donna, a 24-year-old nurse who'd known me for 6 days, cared more about whether I lived or died than the 3 people who'd known me my whole life, who I'd carried in my body or married or raised. I cried more in that hospital from the loneliness than from the actual pain of 3 surgeries combined. And here's something nobody tells you about that particular kind of pain. It doesn't just hurt while it's happening. It teaches you something, cell by cell, about exactly where you stand with people. And once that lesson sets in, you can't unlearn it. You can only decide what you're going to do with it. I was discharged on a Wednesday afternoon. Nobody came to pick me up. I called a cab with hands that still shook from weakness and went home to an apartment that hadn't been checked on in nearly 3 weeks. My plants were dead, every one of them. My mail was stacked up against the door so high it had started to slide sideways onto the floor. I sat down right there in my entryway, too tired to even make it to the couch, and I made myself a promise. I promised myself I would stop confusing obligation with love. I promised myself that the next time my family came around needing something, I would let myself say no, fully, without apologizing for it. I didn't have to wait long. Exactly 19 days after I came home, I'd started counting everything by then, like a woman gathering evidence for a trial only she knew was coming. My phone buzzed with a text from Glenn. Not "how are you feeling," not "I'm sorry I wasn't there," just this. "Hey Donna, exciting news, Audra and Tyler set a date. We found her the perfect dress for the wedding, but it's $9,500 and we're stretched thin right now with the venue deposit. Could you chip in, family? Helps family." I read it 3 times. I actually laughed out loud, alone in my kitchen. The kind of laugh that has no humor in it whatsoever, just disbelief looking for somewhere to land. $9,500. For a dress. For the daughter who hadn't said a single word to me while I was fighting for my life, but apparently had plenty to say about a curling iron. I should tell you a little about Audra, because context matters here. She's 2 years younger than my son, and for as long as I can remember, she's been the one things came easy to, in ways that would almost be funny if they hadn't shaped an entire childhood. When she struggled in algebra, we hired a tutor. When Reed struggled, he was told to try harder. When Audra wanted a car at 16, Glenn bought her a brand new little sedan. Reed got my old Buick, which he had to learn to fix himself because half the time it didn't start. I used to think I was imagining the difference. Kids do that. They assume the worst version of a memory can't really be true about their own family. 19 days alone in a hospital bed has a way of removing every bit of that doubt. Glenn's text just sat there on my screen, glowing, this perfect little artifact of everything wrong with the people I loved. They hadn't called to ask how my recovery was going. They hadn't called to say they were sorry for a single one of those 19 days. They reached out because they needed something. Because that's what I had always been to them. Not a mother, a resource. I thought about writing back a long, furious message detailing every missed day, every hollow text. I drafted it twice and deleted it twice. Because I realized something. They didn't deserve my explanation. They didn't even deserve the kind of anger that takes real effort to put into words. They deserved exactly the amount of effort they had given me. So I opened my banking app, sent $1 to Glenn's account for the dress fund, and in the memo line I typed 2 words. Good luck. Then I put my phone face down on the nightstand and slept better than I had in a month. I want you to picture the chaos that broke loose the next morning, because I certainly pictured it, lying there smiling at my ceiling like I'd won something. My imagination wasn't far off. 14 missed calls from Glenn by 9 a.m., a string of texts from Reed, who in 19 days of my hospitalization had managed exactly 2 messages, suddenly finding it in himself to write full paragraphs. And then, finally, a message from Audra herself. The first words she'd sent me in over a month that weren't about a curling iron. Are you actually serious right now? $1? Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is? Dad showed everyone at the engagement brunch, and now Aunt Pauline thinks you hate me. This is supposed to be the happiest time of my life and you're making it about you. Making it about me. I sat with that sentence for a long, long while. As if surviving 3 surgeries alone. As if grieving the absence of every single person who was supposed to show up for me. As if all 19 days of that silence. As if all of it had been some kind of performance staged purely to inconvenience her dress shopping. I didn't respond that day. I let the messages pile up the way my mail had piled up while I was in the hospital, untouched, accumulating, becoming its own kind of record. It was Glenn who finally called on a voice line 2 days later, instead of texting. I almost let it go to voicemail. Some small, stubborn, hopeful part of me, apparently still slow to learn, made me pick up. Donna, he said, in that tight voice he gets when he's annoyed but trying hard to sound reasonable. What was that about? Audra's humiliated. We just want to help her have a nice wedding. Is that so terrible to ask? I had 3 surgeries a month ago. I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected it. Did you know I almost didn't make it out of the second one? Silence on his end. No, he admitted. I didn't realize it was that serious. You didn't realize because you never asked. None of you did. I was alone in that hospital for 19 days. 19. I watched the woman next to me have somebody there every single day. A nurse brought me Jell-O because she felt bad nobody else came. And now, a month after I came home to a dead apartment and a recovery I had to manage completely by myself, the very first thing any of you reach out about is money. That's not fair, Donna. We were busy. Busy, I repeated. For 19 days, all three of you. Busy. He didn't have an answer for that, because there isn't one. There's no version of busy that explains a family failing to show up for someone fighting for her life. Not when that same family managed to find time for engagement brunches and pressure washers and curling irons in that exact same window. So that $1, I told him, was me telling you exactly how much I have left to give to people who showed me precisely how much they have to give me. You want $9,500 from someone you couldn't be bothered to call more than once in a month? I gave you my answer. I hung up before he could say anything else. It didn't feel like anger. It felt like setting something down that I'd been carrying far too long. But the story doesn't end there. Because 2 weeks later, I learned something that changed everything, I thought. I understood about that month. I was at my cousin Pearl's house for a little get-together. Pearl being one of the only people who'd actually visited me in the hospital twice, with homemade chicken soup and a stack of paperback mysteries, because she remembered I liked them. She mentioned something almost in passing. "I'm just so relieved you're okay," she said. "We were all worried when your mother—" Sorry, when Glenn told everyone you didn't want any visitors. I froze. What? Pearl's face shifted as she realized she'd said something I clearly hadn't known. Glenn told the whole family you specifically said you wanted privacy. That visitors stressed you out. He made it sound like you'd basically asked everyone to stay away. I sat there in Pearl's kitchen with something cold spreading through my chest that had nothing to do with my recovery, because I had never said that. Not once. I remembered with total clarity, telling Glenn multiple times in those first days how badly I wanted someone, anyone, sitting in that chair. He hadn't just failed to show up. He'd constructed a whole story to excuse it, and worse, made my abandonment look like my own choice, my own coldness, instead of the truth. I asked Pearl, gently, if she still had access to the family group thread. The one I'd been quietly dropped from years back after some disagreement over a Thanksgiving seating chart. She hesitated, but eventually let me look. What I found explained everything. Updates from Glenn through the whole month, breezy and reassuring, saying I was resting, doing fine, wanted my space. An exchange between him and Aunt Pauline. Dated right in the middle of my second week, the week I had the fever that scared even the surgeon. Where Glenn wrote he was swamped with wedding stuff. And couldn't help with something Audra needed. Swamped with wedding stuff, while I lay there alone with a fever climbing past 102. There was no mention anywhere of my surgery being serious. No mention of fear, or worry, or urgency. Just a quiet, convenient erasure so nobody would think to ask uncomfortable questions about where everyone had actually been. I sat in my car outside Pearl's house for almost 20 minutes afterward, just breathing, rearranging everything I thought I knew about that month. I'd assumed it was ordinary negligence, busyness, selfishness, the small everyday failures of imperfect people. But this was something else entirely. This was a choice, dressed up and hidden, built specifically so that I would carry the abandonment alone, quietly, without even the small dignity of anyone else knowing what had really happened. That's when I decided $1 wasn't enough. Not because I wanted revenge for its own sake, but because I refused to be the only person who knew the truth. I didn't make a scene. I didn't post some dramatic statement tagging everyone I'd ever met. What I did was quieter, and a lot more effective. I asked Pearl to add me back into that family thread, just long enough to say one thing. When she did, I posted a single message. Timestamped, undeniable. A photo of my hospital discharge papers showing the admission date and the surgery dates, right alongside one line. For anyone who was told I didn't want visitors, that isn't true. I asked for someone, anyone, every single day I was in there. I just never got one. I think people deserve to know that, before the wedding planning goes any further. Then I left the thread, before anyone could respond, because I didn't need to watch the reaction. I just needed the truth to exist somewhere outside my own head. The fallout, Pearl told me later, was substantial. Aunt Pauline, the very one who'd supposedly been told I hated Audra over the $1, Called Glenn directly demanding to know what had really happened. Other relatives who'd quietly wondered, all along, why nobody mentioned visiting me, finally had their answer, and it wasn't flattering to anyone but me. Glenn tried, predictably, to claim I was misremembering, that I'd been on heavy medication and confused. But paperwork doesn't get confused. Dates don't change because someone's uncomfortable with them. The truth had teeth now, and it didn't need his permission to use them. As for the wedding, I heard through Pearl, since I'd made it clear I wasn't interested in talking to Glenn or Audra directly anymore, that it scaled back significantly. No $9,500 dress. A much smaller budget. A much smaller guest list. Because apparently several relatives who'd been ready to chip in suddenly found a new reluctance once they understood the full picture of where everyone had been during my hospitalization. I didn't do any of it to ruin my daughter's wedding. I want to be honest about that. I did it because I refused to swallow cruelty quietly, just so someone else can keep telling a comfortable lie. If the truth made things harder for them, that wasn't my doing. That's simply what happens when a lie finally has to meet daylight. It's been close to a year now. I haven't spoken to Glenn, to Reed, or to Audra since that message in the group thread. No tearful phone call. No apology that suddenly makes sense of any of it. Just quiet. The same quiet they gave me for 19 days, except now it's a quiet I chose. And there's a strange kind of peace in that. What I have instead is Pearl, who shows up every time, without being asked twice. I have a man named Carl, someone I started seeing about 6 months after my discharge, who once drove 40 minutes through a thunderstorm just to bring me soup when I had nothing more than a head cold, because, he told me, that's just what you do for somebody you care about. I have a small circle now of people who understand that showing up isn't optional, isn't conditional, isn't something you do only when there's a deposit due or a dress to buy. I think about that empty chair beside my hospital bed sometimes, all 19 days of it sitting there untouched. A quiet little monument to exactly where I ranked. But I don't carry it with the same grief I used to. I think of it now. It's the moment I finally understood the difference between the people who are family by blood and the people who are family by action. So here's what I keep wondering, because I think about it more than I probably should. If the people who are supposed to love you without conditions only come around when they need something, was $1 and 2 words too harsh? Or was it exactly what they'd earned?